What happens when the man you trusted with your heart betrays you? Not just once, but in the most painful way imaginable. Anika's world shatters when her loving husband admits to an affair. But the true heartbreak isn't just the betrayal. It's the realization that the love they fought for was never enough. As she faces the truth of her marriage and her own worth, Anika must decide, will she let the scars of the past define her? Or will she rise stronger, reclaiming her power and her happiness? This is a story of love lost, self-discovery, and the courage to move on. Welcome to the Alcott Stories family, where love, strength, and resilience come alive in every story. Whether you're a new viewer or have been with us from the start, we're so glad you're here. Get ready for emotional journeys, powerful lessons, and unforgettable moments that will touch your heart. Thank you for being part of this beautiful community. Let's dive in and embrace the stories that remind us all of our own strength and power. Welcome, and enjoy the ride. Anika and James had always been the couple people admired from afar. From the moment they met, sparks flew. But it wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper. Anika, a strong-willed, confident black woman, had faced the world's judgments and stereotypes long before she ever met James. She was used to breaking barriers, standing tall against the weight of society's assumptions about her race, her body, and her place in the world. But when James entered her life, things changed. He wasn't like the others. He saw her, not just as a black woman, but as the intelligent, fierce, and compassionate soul she was. He didn't try to fix her or play the role of the savior. Instead, he embraced her as his equal. James, on the other hand, was a man whose kindness and charisma made him instantly likable to anyone he met. He had always been drawn to people who were strong in spirit and had the courage to be themselves. When he looked at Anika, he saw a woman who had faced adversity and conquered it. Her grace and resilience were magnetic. He wasn't interested in the racial dynamics. He loved her for who she was. Together, they embodied what many believed to be impossible, a love that transcended race, a relationship that proved that connection went beyond the superficial boundaries society had drawn. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had their challenges, like every couple, but they were always able to talk through them, to heal. Their love was their foundation, and it was unshakable. It wasn't just about romantic gestures or passionate dates. It was about the late-night talks, the shared dreams, and the way they held each other during difficult moments. James had stood by Anika through countless trials, from the subtle racism she experienced at work to the harsh criticisms they faced from strangers who couldn't fathom how their love could be real. But they didn't care. They were a team, stronger together than they had ever been apart. Family and friends adored their bond. Anika's friends, who were often skeptical of interracial relationships, came to see James as part of their circle. He was never the other. He was family. Anika's parents, too, had welcomed James with open arms. They could see the way he treated her, with respect, admiration, and love. They weren't concerned with the color of his skin. They were only concerned with how he made their daughter feel. But even in the glow of their seemingly perfect life, Anika couldn't escape the occasional pang of doubt that lingered deep within her. She was aware of the world's gaze, the whispers behind their backs. But every time she looked into James's eyes, those fears seemed to dissipate. He made her feel seen, understood, and loved in ways she hadn't thought possible. He didn't just love her because of her strength. He loved her for her softness, for her vulnerability, for her ability to forgive even when the world seemed so unforgiving. Together, they built a life that defied expectations, one where race didn't determine their worth or their place in each other's lives. They talked about their future, about children, about growing old together. They would walk hand in hand, showing the world that love, true, deep love, was never limited by the things society tried to use to divide them. Every shared laugh, every quiet moment in the morning sun, every kiss before bed, felt like an affirmation of their unbreakable bond. James and Anika's love was a testament to the belief that despite the obstacles, despite the judgments, love could conquer it all. They were not just a couple. They were a force, two souls intertwined in a way that made every struggle worth it. In their world, nothing else mattered but the love they shared. And for a while, it seemed as though they could withstand anything. But what Anika couldn't know, what no one could foresee, was that sometimes, even the strongest relationships have cracks hidden beneath the surface. The air in their home had always been one of comfort and warmth, a place where Anika and James could shed the world's expectations and just be. But that night, something felt off. Anika noticed the unease in James's eyes, the nervous fidgeting of his hands, and the strained silence that hung in the air between them. They had spent so many years together, laughing through the ups and supporting each other through the downs, that she knew something was wrong. She tried to brush it off, but the tension was undeniable. She could feel her heart racing and unspoken dread settling in her chest. "James?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Is there something you need to tell me?" He hesitated for a long moment before his shoulders slumped, as if he could no longer carry the weight of the secret he had been holding. His eyes met hers, but there was no longer the warmth that once filled them. Instead, there was guilt, raw, unapologetic guilt. Anika's stomach tightened, the dread intensifying, but she couldn't prepare herself for the words that followed. "I've been seeing someone else," James confessed, his voice shaky, filled with regret. "Her name is Emma. She's younger, and I don't know how it happened. I didn't mean to hurt you, Anika. I swear." Anika stood there in shock, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was hearing. She thought she misheard him. Her body went cold as the words sank in, each one a cruel dagger twisting in her chest. "What?" she whispered, the world around her seeming to tilt, spinning into a dizzying blur. James's face crumpled with remorse, but the damage was already done. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the way her body stiffened, the way she looked at him like a stranger. He tried to explain, to give context to his actions, but his words fell flat. "I didn't know what I was missing, Anika," he continued, his voice broken. "I thought I was looking for something I lost in our marriage, something that was gone for too long, and I found it in her." The words sliced through her like a blade, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. How could he? How could he betray her like this? The man she had trusted with her heart, with her entire being, had chosen to give that trust to someone else. And not just anyone, but someone who was everything she was not. Young, white, and the complete opposite of the woman who had stood by his side through every trial, every obstacle. Emma wasn't just another woman. She was a reminder of all the societal pressures they had fought against together. She was a symbol of everything they had worked so hard to overcome. And yet, James had chosen her. Anika's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the pieces wouldn't fit. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead, she stood frozen, her body betraying her shock, unable to react. How could he? The man she had shared her deepest fears with, the man she had trusted with every part of her soul, had not only broken her trust but had shattered the very foundation of their love. She could feel the tears gathering in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. Instead, she fought to maintain composure, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her entire body trembling with rage and disbelief. "So that's it?" she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "You couldn't come to me?" You couldn't talk to me about what was missing in our marriage? Instead, you chose to lie and cheat? James opened his mouth to speak, to offer some sort of apology, but no words came. What could he say? Nothing could undo the betrayal. Nothing could erase the hurt in her eyes or the sense of utter loss that filled her chest. She felt as though everything they had built together, every late-night conversation, every laugh they shared, every quiet moment of understanding, had been ripped away in an instant. I gave you everything, Anika continued, her voice trembling now, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. And this is how you repay me? With a lie? With an affair? James reached out, desperate to make her understand, but she pulled back as if his touch was poison. No, she whispered, her eyes red with the beginnings of the pain that would soon consume her. I don't want to hear it. You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to justify what you did. Anika turned away from him then, her heart breaking into pieces with each step. She had loved him with everything she had. She had sacrificed parts of herself to make their relationship work, to make sure they were stronger than the world around them. But in the end, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for James. She couldn't look at him anymore, not as her husband, not as the man she had trusted with her heart. What was left to trust? What was left to believe in? The man who had promised to stand by her had turned his back on her when she needed him most. As Anika walked out of the room, the weight of the betrayal felt like it was crushing her chest. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the fact that James had chosen another woman. It was the realization that everything she had believed in, their love, their connection, the dreams they had shared, was a lie. She had given him everything, and in return, he had chosen someone who represented the very opposite of their fight, their unity. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. In that moment, Anika knew that she would never be the same. The pain was too deep, the wound too fresh. And though she had once believed their love was unbreakable, she now saw it for what it was. Fragile. Fragile enough to be shattered by one man's moment of weakness. One moment of betrayal. James could apologize until the end of time, but nothing would erase the damage he had done. The woman he had loved was no longer the same, and the man he had been was lost forever. The days that followed the revelation of James's betrayal felt like a never-ending storm. Each moment was heavy, suffocating, as though the very air in the room had been thickened with the weight of Anika's grief. Her body moved through the motions, getting out of bed, going to work, forcing herself to smile when others asked how she was doing. But inside, she was crumbling. Every step she took felt like it was dragging her further away from the woman she once was, the woman who had loved so freely, so fully. She sat in their home, the place where they had built memories, their laughter echoing in every corner, and all she could feel was emptiness. The walls that once held their love seemed like cold, indifferent witnesses to her pain. The kitchen table where they had shared late-night dinners, the living room where they had curled up together watching movies. Now, they felt like tombs of a past life. How could the space they had created together now feel so foreign? How could she still be here, in this house, when everything she had known had been torn apart? Anika tried to hold it together. She had always been strong, independent, someone who could handle anything life threw at her. But this was different. This wasn't just another challenge to overcome. It was an emotional war, one that she hadn't signed up for, one that she couldn't seem to win. Her mind raced in endless circles, repeating the same questions over and over. Why? Why did he do this? Was I not enough for him? The pain of the betrayal was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about losing James. It was about everything she had believed their love stood for. Had it all been a lie? Was it her race that made her insufficient in his eyes? Was that the missing piece he had been searching for with Emma? The weight of those questions pressed on her chest like a boulder, suffocating her thoughts, stealing her breath. The idea that maybe it was because of who she was, because of the color of her skin, that he had turned to another woman was almost too painful to bear. It made her feel small, invisible, as if her very existence hadn't been enough to keep him committed. The constant thought that her blackness, her beauty, her strength could never be enough in his eyes clawed at her soul. She tried to push these thoughts away, to convince herself that it wasn't about race, but the more she tried to deny it, the louder the whispers in her mind became. The world she lived in, where the beauty of black love had often been marginalized or misunderstood, felt like a cruel irony. She had always prided herself on overcoming the world's judgments, but here, in this moment, the betrayal felt not just personal but racially charged. It was as if the very fight they had waged together, the struggle to love without judgment, had been meaningless. Was she really just the token black wife in his eyes? A symbol of defiance to the world, but not enough to keep his loyalty when temptation appeared? The shame of it all consumed her. It wasn't just about being cheated on. It was about being cheated on by a white man who had once sworn he loved her for who she was. It was about the inner conflict of knowing that, despite their shared history, despite everything they had fought for as a couple, in the end, it wasn't enough to keep him. And that cut deeper than any betrayal of trust. Her friends, who had been there for her through thick and thin, rallied around her with words of support. They told her she was strong, that she would heal, that she deserved better than a man who could so easily throw away everything they had built. They tried to comfort her, to remind her of her worth. But Anika knew the truth. This wasn't just about a man. It wasn't just about her heart being broken. This betrayal wasn't just personal, it was racial too. She didn't know if anyone could truly understand the depths of the pain she felt, the quiet, insidious feeling of not being enough, not just for him, but for the world. Even in the presence of her loved ones, Anika felt alone. She could talk to them about the pain of betrayal, the loss of trust, but no one truly understood the weight of being a black woman who had been left for a younger, whiter woman. The world saw her strength, but they didn't see the quiet struggles she had to endure every day, the racial microaggressions, the constant need to prove her worth. Her friends couldn't understand how this betrayal wasn't just a personal wound. It felt like a reflection of every injustice, every stereotype, every battle she had fought her entire life. It was as if her very identity had been rejected, not just by James, but by the world he had chosen to embrace instead. The silence of those long nights became her battleground. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in her mind, wondering if she had missed the signs, wondering if she had been blind to the cracks in their relationship. Was there something she could have done differently? Could she have been more attentive, more open? But in her heart, she knew this wasn't her fault. This wasn't about her. It was about James's inability to value the woman she was, the person who had stood by his side, fighting for a love that was pure and real, even when the world didn't understand it. The struggle didn't end with the nights. The days were just as difficult. At work, she wore her smile like a mask, pretending everything was fine. Her coworkers, who knew her as the confident, driven woman who never let anything stand in her way, had no idea what she was carrying inside. It was easier to smile through the pain than to explain it, to let people see how broken she was. She would laugh at the casual jokes, talk about her day, but all the while, her mind was miles away, trapped in the prison of her own thoughts. No one could see the cracks forming beneath her surface. No one could hear the silent cries for help. At times she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her own emotions. Her pain wasn't just about losing James. It was about losing herself. How could she trust again? How could she let someone else into her heart when the man she had loved so deeply had ripped it apart? The fear of being vulnerable again, of loving without walls, was paralyzing. And so, she closed herself off. Even more so than before. Her heart ached not just for the love she had lost, but for the love she was now terrified to give. But in the quiet of those moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, a spark of clarity began to form. She wasn't broken. She wasn't the problem. The world had tried to tell her, over and over again, that her worth was tied to someone else's love, someone else's validation. But she realized her worth had never been defined by James. It had always been within her. And slowly, though the struggle was painful, she began to understand that this journey was about reclaiming that power. It wasn't going to be easy. The pain would linger, the doubts would come. But Anika knew that the fight was worth it. The battle she faced wasn't just about forgiving James. It was about forgiving herself. It was about embracing her own strength and understanding that she didn't need anyone's approval, not from him, not from anyone, to know that she was enough. It had been a few weeks since the devastation of James's betrayal had left Anika hollow and struggling to make sense of her emotions. She had been trying to move on, to heal, to find a semblance of peace amidst the chaos. But the pain lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake, and each day felt like another battle. While her friends and family continued to offer their support, the wounds in her heart were still raw and trust seemed like a distant, unreachable place. Anika's mother, Evelyn, had always been a source of strength for her. A fierce woman, sharp-eyed and perceptive, Evelyn had always been there when Anika needed her most. Over the years, she had watched her daughter grow into a confident, independent woman who fought hard for her happiness. But after Anika's marriage to James, Evelyn had noticed a change in her daughter. Anika, once so vibrant and full of life, had become quieter, withdrawn, her eyes reflecting an uncertainty that wasn't there before. Evelyn didn't speak much about her concerns, but she had always felt a nagging sense that something wasn't right. There were little signs, unspoken moments that caused her to question James's commitment, even though he had appeared to be the perfect husband. That afternoon, Evelyn, who'd flown into town for a visit, decided to take some time to herself. Anika had been busy with work, and Evelyn knew she needed a break from the emotional tension of the situation. She ventured out to the mall to pick up a few things, hoping the quiet of the day would give her a sense of peace. Little did she know, this trip would shatter any lingering doubts she had and provide a horrifying confirmation of everything she feared. As she entered a boutique, scanning the racks of clothes with distracted interest, something caught her eye. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw them. James and Emma. There they were, standing in the middle of the store, hand in hand, laughing, their bodies close in a way that felt too intimate, too comfortable. Emma, with her perfect blonde hair and flawless smile, was the epitome of everything Anika wasn't, everything that, in Evelyn's eyes, James had rejected when he turned away from his daughter. Evelyn stood frozen in place, her mind racing as she tried to process what she was seeing. It was as though the floor had dropped out from under her. She wanted to scream, to confront them right then and there, but her body refused to move. Instead, she watched in stunned silence as they continued their carefree laughter, completely oblivious to her presence. The fact that they were so at ease, so unashamed, made Evelyn's stomach turn. She had always feared that James wasn't truly committed to Anika, but seeing it firsthand, the way he was so open with Emma, the way he acted as though his betrayal didn't matter, was like a punch to the gut. She wanted to tear them apart, to shout the truth to the world, but something stopped her. Anika didn't need to see this. Not here. Not now. She couldn't be the one to reveal this particular truth. Instead, Evelyn turned quickly, her heart pounding, and made her way out of the boutique. She couldn't bear to watch them for another second, and yet she couldn't shake the image of them together, of her daughter's husband smiling with another woman, as if Anika had never existed in his world. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone, dialing Anika's number. Each ring felt like a lifetime, and Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest. She didn't know how to tell her daughter this, but she knew she had no choice. Anika needed to know the truth. She deserved to hear it from someone who loved her. When Anika finally picked up, Evelyn's voice was quiet, trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Anika, listen to me very carefully," she whispered, trying to steady herself. "I saw James. He was with that woman. They were holding hands and laughing like a couple, right here in the mall. You need to know the truth." Anika's blood ran cold. Her mother's words pierced through her like a knife, each syllable carrying a weight that she wasn't prepared to bear. She could feel her world crashing down around her as the truth seeped into her bones. She had already known deep down that James wasn't the man he pretended to be. She had tried to shield herself from the reality, tried to convince herself that maybe it was just a momentary lapse, a mistake. But hearing her mother say it out loud, hearing the certainty in her voice, made it undeniable. This wasn't a fleeting affair. This was something real, something ongoing, something that had been happening behind her back all along. For a moment, Anika could barely breathe. The sadness that flooded her heart was overwhelming. She had always thought of James as the love of her life, the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin. But now, she realized, he'd never truly been the man she thought he was. The man who had promised to love her, to cherish her, had chosen someone else. And not just anyone, someone who represented everything that Anika wasn't. Emma, with her fair skin, blonde hair, and effortless beauty, was everything Anika had fought against in her own life. She was a stark reminder of the world's biases and prejudices, and yet, she was the one James had turned to. The betrayal hurt, yes, but this felt like something deeper. This felt like a rejection not just of her, but of everything she had fought for. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Anika didn't know what to say, how to respond to her mother's painful revelation. She could feel the tears welling in her eyes, but she fought them back, trying to keep her composure. "I'm sorry, baby," Evelyn continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but you deserve to know the truth. I'm here for you, always." Anika closed her eyes, letting the weight of her mother's words settle in. The truth was out now, and it was no longer something she could ignore. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had chosen someone else. And this time, the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. She didn't know what to do, how to move forward. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never let James's betrayal define her. Not now. Not ever. "Thank you, Mom," Anika finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll be okay. I need some time to process all of this." As she hung up the phone, Anika felt a mixture of disbelief, anger, and deep, aching sorrow. Her heart felt like it was being torn in two, but deep down, she knew this was the turning point. This was the moment she would take control of her own story, no longer defined by the man who had failed her. She would find her strength again. It was just going to take time. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something that would allow her to heal and move on, despite the betrayal that had shattered her heart. The weight of James's betrayal was a heavy burden that had been dragging Anika down for what felt like an eternity. It had consumed her every thought, every action, and left her feeling hollow, as if a piece of her had been ripped away. The days had blurred together, each one a little darker than the last, filled with the pain of unanswered questions and broken promises. Her heart had been shattered, and no matter how many people tried to reassure her that she would heal, no one could truly understand the depth of her sorrow. But one evening, something shifted. It wasn't sudden, nor was it dramatic. It was more like the quiet realization that she had been drowning, and she had reached the point where she couldn't take it anymore. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, and for the first time in months she saw herself, truly saw herself, not as the woman who had been betrayed, not as the wife who had been left for someone else, but as Anika, the woman who had fought every day to rise above society's expectations and limitations. Her gaze lingered on her face, tracing the lines of strength she had once known so well. There was a softness in her eyes that had been dimmed by pain, but now she saw a glimmer of something else: defiance. She wasn't the broken woman she had felt like for so long. She was a force, a woman who deserved to be valued for who she was, not just for who someone else wanted her to be. She felt a surge of something inside her, something that had been buried beneath the weight of her hurt. It was a quiet whisper that grew louder with each passing second, telling her that she was enough, that she didn't need to stay in a marriage where she was constantly undervalued, that her worth was not tied to a man who could not see the power and beauty she brought into the world, that she deserved so much more. And at that moment, Anika made a decision that changed everything. She was done. With trembling hands, she began to pack her things, the clothes she had worn while trying to hold on to a love that no longer existed, the pictures of a life that had been shattered by betrayal. Everything that once represented their life together now felt like a weight she could no longer carry. Each item she packed was a step toward freedom, a symbolic act of reclaiming herself from the life she had built with James. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the tears would rise, when the pain would flood her chest and she would question if she was doing the right thing. But deep down, she knew she had no other choice. She couldn't stay in a place that no longer served her. She had to move on. Her decision was an act of self-preservation, a choice to prioritize her own well-being over the crumbling remnants of a relationship that had failed her. She had spent so many years giving her all to a man who couldn't see her worth, who had discarded her without a second thought. But she was done being someone's second choice. She was done with the lies, done with the uncertainty, done with being invisible in her own marriage. With every item she packed, Anika felt a little more liberated. The ache in her heart was still there, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet strength that she had been afraid to embrace. For so long, she had allowed herself to be defined by her love for James, by the way their relationship was supposed to be. But now, she was reclaiming her narrative. This was her life, and she had the power to write her own story. When the last box was packed and the apartment was empty, Anika didn't feel sorrow or regret. Instead, she felt a sense of relief, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't walking away from love. She was walking toward herself. She was leaving behind a chapter that no longer served her, and stepping into the unknown, uncertain of what the future held, but trusting in herself to handle whatever came her way. Anika moved into a new apartment, a space that felt like a fresh start. The walls, though bare and unfamiliar, gave her the room to breathe. She surrounded herself with things that brought her joy: her books, her art, the little trinkets that reminded her of her strength and creativity. Her new home wasn't just a place to live, it was a reflection of who she was, a woman who had endured, who had survived, and who was now ready to thrive. In the quiet moments of solitude, Anika allowed herself to heal. She didn't rush the process. She didn't force herself to move on or pretend like the pain wasn't there. She gave herself permission to feel it all: the hurt, the anger, the confusion. But she also gave herself permission to let it go when she was ready. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to rebuild her life. Not for anyone else, but for herself. She threw herself into her work, her passions, the things that had always made her feel alive. She reconnected with the friends and family who truly cared about her, the people who saw her for who she was, an incredible, strong, beautiful woman. Their support was the foundation she had always needed, and it became a reminder that love wasn't just about a man. It was about the people who stood beside her, who lifted her up, who reminded her of her worth when she couldn't see it herself. Anika's healing was not a linear journey, but it was hers. She discovered parts of herself she had forgotten along the way: her independence, her strength, her unshakable belief in her worth. She had always been enough. She always would be. The pain of James's betrayal would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined her. It was just one chapter of her story, and now she was writing the next one on her own terms. And with each day, the woman who had once felt lost, broken, and invisible was finding her way back to the woman she had always been. She was not just surviving, she was living for herself. And that, in itself, was a triumph. The silence in James's world was deafening. For weeks he had been left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. The affair with Emma, the lies, the betrayal, and the devastating reality that the woman he had once called his soulmate had walked away from him. Each day without Anika felt like an eternity. The man who had once been so confident, so assured of his place in her life, was now a shadow of himself. Every corner he turned, every quiet moment he spent alone, reminded him of the one thing he had lost, the only thing that had truly mattered. At first, James had convinced himself that his affair with Emma was just a fleeting distraction. He had told himself that it was nothing more than a moment of weakness, that it was simply about trying to feel something, anything, other than the pressures of his marriage. But as time passed, as the numbness wore off and the reality of his actions set in, the truth became undeniable. Emma had been nothing but a brief escape from the real issues he had been too afraid to confront. The pain of losing Anika hit him harder than he could have ever anticipated. He had underestimated how deeply she had become ingrained in his life, how her presence had shaped every part of his world. The laughter they shared, the quiet moments when they would just be in each other's company, he had taken it all for granted. He had never truly appreciated the depth of their bond until it was gone. And now, without her, everything felt empty. James's attempts to reach out to Anika had been futile. He sent message after message, each one more desperate than the last. He poured his heart out in his texts, pleading for a chance to explain, for an opportunity to show her that he was truly sorry. He acknowledged the betrayal, the hurt he had caused, and the irreparable damage to the trust they had built over the years. Yet, each time he looked at his phone, the truth settled in. He had already lost her. And no matter how many apologies he offered, no matter how many heartfelt messages he sent, the words felt hollow. Anika had already moved on, emotionally, mentally, and physically, and he knew he had no right to expect forgiveness. But that didn't stop him from trying. Each day he found himself consumed by regret, as if his own guilt was suffocating him. He couldn't escape the thought of her, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, only to betray her trust in the most painful way. His mind was constantly consumed with the image of Anika's face, the pain in her eyes when she had discovered the truth, the heartbreak that was now etched into the fabric of their shared history. It was late one evening when, in a haze of desperation, James decided he couldn't live with himself any longer. He needed to see Anika. He needed to beg her for forgiveness, to plead with her for a chance to make things right, even if he didn't deserve it. He didn't know if she would even open the door, if she would even listen, but he had to try. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, James made his way to Anika's new apartment. His once polished appearance had been replaced by a disheveled, broken version of himself. His eyes were red from crying, his face unshaven, and his voice was thick with emotion. Every step he took felt like it carried the weight of his mistakes. The guilt and regret wrapped around him like a suffocating cloak, and he wasn't sure how he was still standing, let alone walking to the door of the woman he had failed so completely. When he knocked, his heart was pounding in his chest. He stood there, his hands trembling as the door slowly creaked open. And there she was, Anika, standing before him, composed, strong, and unbroken. The woman he had once adored, the woman he had shattered with his own selfishness, was now a stranger to him. He had lost the right to call her his, and he knew it. "Please, Anika, I need you to forgive me, he whispered, his voice breaking with raw emotion. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I can't live with myself knowing I've hurt you like this. His words were rushed, desperate, tumbling over one another. He could see the flicker of sadness in her eyes, but there was no trace of the warmth and affection she once had for him. All he could see now was the strength she had found in the wake of his betrayal. Anika's gaze was steady, unwavering. She had been through the storms of grief, the crushing waves of heartbreak, and now she stood before him as a woman who knew her worth, a woman who had finally learned to stand on her own. There was no anger in her eyes, no hatred, only clarity. She had moved on. She had healed. You want forgiveness, she said, her voice calm and measured. But the weight of her words carried an unmistakable finality. But forgiveness is not something you can ask for after you've destroyed the trust that took years to build. What you did was not just a mistake, James. You took something that I gave to you freely and betrayed it. You chose to hurt me because it was easier than facing the complexities of our love. You chose yourself over me. Her words cut through the silence, each one sinking deep into his chest like a knife. He had no response, no excuse, because deep down, he knew she was right. He had chosen Emma, chosen a fleeting fantasy over the real, imperfect, beautiful love he had shared with Anika. And now, he was paying the price. James's heart shattered. But he also knew that he had no right to ask for her forgiveness. Not now. Not after everything he had done. The tears that filled his eyes were not for pity, not for himself, but for the woman he had lost, because he had never truly appreciated her until it was too late. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. But I understand if you never forgive me. I don't deserve it. Anika didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes, and as James stood there, broken and defeated, he realized that forgiveness was not something he could ask for, but something that had to be earned. Through actions, through growth, through a willingness to change. And at that moment, he knew that he had lost Anika forever. She had already forgiven herself. Anika stood in the doorway, her heart calm and steady as James' pleas echoed in her mind. There was a time, not so long ago, when she might have given in, when she would have let her emotions lead her back into his arms, hoping for the man she had once loved to return. But that was before the betrayal, before the realization that she didn't need James, or anyone, to define her worth. She had spent countless nights drowning in sorrow, questioning everything she had believed about love. She had cried until her tears felt like an ocean, hoping for answers that never came. But in the quiet stillness of her own soul, she had found the truth. She was enough. She had always been enough. And as she looked into James's tear-streaked face, she realized that she no longer needed his validation, his love, or his forgiveness. Anika's voice was steady, unwavering when she spoke the words that would sever the last of their ties. I've already moved on, she whispered softly. But there was power in her words. Not just from you, but from the belief that I ever needed you to complete me. I am whole, on my own. Those words hung in the air like a final verdict. The pain that had once seemed insurmountable had been replaced with something far stronger: self-respect, self-love, and an unshakable understanding of her own worth. She had spent so many years trying to build her life around a relationship, thinking that it defined her. But now she realized it was her own strength that would carry her forward. She could see the shock in James's eyes. She could feel the regret radiating off of him, but she no longer felt any pity for him. He was a man who had made his choices, and those choices had led him to this moment. A moment where Anika had already moved on, emotionally, mentally, and physically. She had rebuilt herself long before he had come to her door. There was no anger in her, only a sense of finality. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to make him feel the pain that she had felt for so long. She had learned to let go, not for him but for herself. Anika turned her back on James, slowly closing the door between them with quiet finality. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the hallway, but inside, there was only peace. As the door closed, she let out a long breath, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from her chest. The past was behind her, and with it, the toxic remnants of a love that had failed. She had stepped into her future, one that would be built on her own terms. Outside, James stood frozen, his face a mask of devastation. He had come with hope, with a desperate desire to win her back, but all he had found was the harsh reality that he had already lost her. There was no going back, no undoing the damage he had caused. As he stood there, a sense of emptiness washed over him. He had taken the love of his life for granted, and now she was gone. Gone for good. The regret he felt was a cold, suffocating reminder of the choices he had made. He had betrayed her trust, broken the bond that they had spent years building, and now there was no way to repair the damage. James's tears were a silent acknowledgement of his failure, but they did nothing to change the fact that Anika was no longer his. She had moved on, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions, alone. Lesson to society. This story serves as a painful but crucial reminder that betrayal is not just the loss of love. It is the destruction of trust, respect, and the bond that forms the foundation of any meaningful relationship. In this world, we often view love through a superficial lens, focusing on fleeting desires and external appearances. But true love is built on much deeper values: honesty, commitment, and respect. Anika's journey teaches us that the real strength doesn't lie in seeking forgiveness from others. It lies in taking responsibility for our actions, accepting the pain we have caused, and understanding that some wounds are too deep to mend with a simple apology. Healing is a personal journey. It comes from within, from realizing that we are enough, regardless of the betrayals we face or the mistakes others make. Anika's decision to move on wasn't just about leaving a man behind. It was about reclaiming her power, her dignity, and her self-worth. She didn't need James to validate her. She had learned to validate herself. She had found her strength in the process of healing, and that strength would carry her forward, not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned to thrive. This story calls us all to reflect on how we treat the people we love. It challenges us to reconsider the value of genuine connection, respect, and trust, and to understand that love should never be based on superficial characteristics or fleeting desires. True love is about seeing someone for who they truly are, embracing their flaws, and respecting the bond that is built over time. It is about standing by someone, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. Anika's story is a testament to the power of self-love and resilience. She shows us that no matter what happens, no matter the hurt, no matter the betrayal, we are enough. And in a society where love is often bound by race, appearance, or superficial expectations, Anika's journey is a call for us all to rise above these limitations and choose love that is real, authentic, and rooted in respect and trust.